Hercule Poirot and the Secret of the Forbidden Garden. Chapter 1. The Shadow Among the Rose Bushes. The de Leracq estate, tucked away among the rolling hills of the Touraine region, was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. The air smelled of old lavender, and the song of blackbirds was barely disturbed by the distant murmur of the Cher River. The Château de la Valinière, with its ivy-covered stone facade and Gothic windows, had been owned by the family for generations. But that morning the calm had been shattered by a scream that still echoed among the perfectly trimmed hedges of the garden. It was the maid who discovered him. She was carrying a tray of coffee to the greenhouse, where Madame Geneviève de Leracq used to spend her mornings with her orchids. Instead, she found the elderly matriarch collapsed among the forbidden rose bushes, an area of the garden to which no one had been allowed access since the death of Genevieve's first husband more than 30 years earlier. Her face was frozen in an expression of terror, and between her withered fingers she clutched a small blue flower, a variety found nowhere else in the garden. The death was initially classified as cardiac arrest, understandable for an 83-year-old woman, but there were details that didn't add up. The gardener, a sullen man of few words named Bastien, swore that the gate to the forbidden garden was always locked. The flower Madame de Leracq was holding didn't belong in the greenhouse. And most disturbing of all, someone had carefully placed an antique iron bench in front of the crime scene, as if expecting someone to witness the old woman's final moment. The local police, short on resources and experience in high society affairs, were quick to close the case. But not everyone was satisfied. This wasn't a natural death. Miss Camille Dupré, the deceased's personal secretary, said gravely to the inspector in charge, "Madame had enemies, though she hid them behind her porcelain smile." It was the family's young lawyer, Etienne Roussel, who decided to write to Belgium. He had heard about the legendary retired detective who now lived in a modest apartment near Place Jourdan in Brussels. He didn't expect a reply, but 3 days later a telegram arrived with the precision of a Swiss watch. "I gladly accept your invitation. I will arrive at La Valinière early Thursday. Please prepare a list of the house's occupants and leave the location where the body was found undisturbed. H. Poirot." And so, with his characteristic punctuality, Hercule Poirot arrived at the Saint-Pierre-des-Corps train station, with his usual immaculate leather briefcase, his polished walking stick, and his perfectly waxed moustache. He was greeted by Roussel himself, who led him through country roads to the entrance of the château. Poirot, standing in front of the wrought-iron gate, raised an eyebrow at the sight of the path covered in dead leaves. "I don't like it," he murmured. "There's carelessness in the air, and where there's carelessness, there can be deception." Inside, the house was silent. The servants spoke in whispers. In the main hall, an imposing portrait of Madame de Leracq dominated the room. Her stern face, painted in cold tones, seemed to observe those present with eternal judgment. Poirot was led into the dining room, where a table set with tea and biscuits and a row of anxious faces awaited him. There were the suspects. Camille Dupré, the young, sharp-eyed secretary who claimed to know all her boss's secrets. Bastien, the secretive gardener, who had the keys to the forbidden garden and an unclear past. Etienne Roussel, the ambitious and refined lawyer, whose relationship with the lady seemed to exceed strictly professional limits. Miss Irene de Leracq, the niece of the deceased, known for her melancholic beauty and her reputation as a bohemian artist. Paul Aubrey, the butler, rigid and helpful, who had been in the house for more than 30 years. Each one greeted Poirot with due courtesy, but behind the formal words lay something deeper: discomfort, tension, and perhaps fear. Poirot settled into his chair, carefully crossed his legs, and with a slight gesture indicated that they could begin. "My lords and ladies," he said softly, "I'm not here to judge, but to understand. And believe me, sooner or later, the truth finds its way. Even among the rose bushes." Silence fell like a veil over the room. Poirot poured himself a cup of tea and smiled slightly. The game had begun. Chapter 2. The Rusty Key. The following morning dawned shrouded in a faint mist that hung over the gardens of La Valinière like a spectral whisper. Hercule Poirot, punctual as a Swiss watch, appeared in the reading room at 8 o'clock. Dressed in a pearl-grey suit, with a neatly folded handkerchief in his pocket, he was leafing through a crumpled copy of The Morning, when Camille Dupré entered, holding a notebook and frowning slightly. "Monsieur Poirot," he said in a firm but cordial voice, "as you requested, I have prepared a detailed list of the estate's current inhabitants, as well as their usual schedules and routines." Poirot took the notebook with a slight bow. "Mademoiselle, you are the epitome of efficiency. Now tell me, was it common for Madame de Leracq to walk alone to the forbidden garden?" Camille shook her head. "Never. She considered it a cursed place. She said that since the death of her first husband, no foot should set foot there again. She had the gate locked, and no one was allowed in. Only Bastien had the key. Or so we thought." Poirot stroked his moustache thoughtfully. "Beliefs don't interest me as much as facts, mademoiselle. Could you please have Bastien come here?" Few minutes later, the gardener appeared, rubbing his work-wrinkled hands together. He was a broad-shouldered man with a sullen expression, his dark eyes avoiding eye contact. "Mr. Poirot?" "Bastien, let's talk about the gate to the forbidden garden. Do you have the only key?" "Yes, sir. It's kept in my shed, locked up too. It's never been lost. Could you show it to me?" Bastien nodded wordlessly, and led Poirot and Camille along a stony path to the shed. Inside, among hanging tools and empty flower pots, he opened a wooden drawer containing a large key, rusty around the edges, lying on a linen cloth. Poirot examined it carefully. Then, with a delicate gesture, he smelled it and dabbed it with a white handkerchief. "Interesting," he murmured. "This key hasn't been used in weeks. There are no fresh traces of soil, no signs of friction, and yet the lady was found inside the garden. How did she get in?" Bastien frowned. "I don't know, sir. No one goes in there. No one would dare." Poirot turned to Camille. "Mademoiselle, who else could have had access to a copy? Maybe Paul, the butler. He's been here all his life. Or even the lady herself, if she kept a hidden copy." Poirot didn't reply immediately. He scanned the shed slowly, taking in seemingly insignificant details. A watering can with dry soil in the nozzle, a spade with a worn handle, a rope dangling like a sleeping snake. "The lady was holding a blue flower in her hand," he said suddenly, as if thinking aloud. Do you recognize that species?" Bastien shrugged. "None of our flowers are that colour, and there's none like that in the greenhouse either. It doesn't grow here." Poirot nodded slowly, with a fleeting smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So, we have a flower that doesn't belong in the garden, a key that hasn't been used, and an old woman who would never have crossed that gate alone. What a curious combination." Camille shuddered slightly. "Do you think they pushed her in?" Poirot narrowed his eyes. "Or that they convinced her. Sometimes a whisper is all it takes to move someone to cross a threshold they swore they'd never step on." They walked back toward the house. Poirot requested a thorough inspection of the bench where the woman had been found, and Camille promised to bring photographs taken by the police before the body was removed. Already in the hall, Irène de Lérac appeared descending the stairs, wrapped in a black satin robe, with a lit cigarette dangling between her fingers. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice drawling, her smile as decorative as her amethyst pendant. "Are you enjoying our mansion of secrets?" Poirot inclined his head. "Slightly, madam. I don't enjoy it. I watch." She laughed, but the laughter did not touch her eyes. Aunt Geneviève had many secrets. But don't worry. Most of them are already underground with her. Poirot looked at her carefully, then lowered his gaze to her velvet slippers where a few patches of dried earth were barely noticeable on the edge of the left sole. "And you, mademoiselle, do you have secrets you don't want to come to light?" Irène looked at him for a second, then took a long drag on her cigarette. "We all have a garden we'd rather not show, Monsieur Poirot." And he left, leaving behind a sweet scent and an awkward silence. Poirot said nothing, but his gaze returned to the forbidden garden, visible in the distance through a window in the corridor. It had begun to rain. The flowers were sleeping in the mist, but he knew that the earth hid more than roots. It hid truths. Chapter 3. The Silent Greenhouse. The rain continued to fall throughout the afternoon, as if the sky shared the silent morning that permeated La Valinière. Hercule Poirot, after a light meal he ate alone, asked to visit the greenhouse, not out of love for plants, of course, but out of his absolute faith that objects, like people, speak if one learns to listen. Paul Aubrey, the butler, was the one who led him. He walked stiffly, his hands clasped behind his back, and spoke little, as if every word were an unnecessary waste. "Madame used to spend several hours here," he said as he unlocked the greenhouse door with a small brass key. "She said the orchids listened to her without judgment." Poirot nodded, entering slowly. The humid warmth of the place enveloped the senses. The flower pots were perfectly aligned, the flowers lovingly nurtured, and the air had a faint scent of living earth and wet leaves. But more than that, the place conveyed a stillness, rehearsed. Who else had access here, Monsieur Aubry? Just Madame Camille and me. Although Irène came around sometimes for inspiration, or so she said. Poirot walked between the shelves, stopping at a work table where gardening tools, botanical labels, a notebook, and a magnifying glass lay. Did Madame write in this notebook? Yes, every day. Observations about his plants and sometimes thoughts. Poirot flipped through a few pages. The writing was small, elegant. He began to read in a low voice. "My sister will never understand. The roots of the past still strangle the stems of today. The forbidden garden is not cursed. It is sacred. He raised an eyebrow. Did the lady have a sister? I had, the butler corrected with a hint of bitterness. But they haven't spoken to each other for over 30 years. Family disputes. Biag, inheritance? For love. Or the kind of love that causes wars, Monsieur. Poirot gently closed the notebook and put it back where he had found it. Interesting. Tell me, what do you know about the blue flower the lady was holding when she died? Aubrey frowned. Nothing. I've never seen it before. It doesn't grow here. Poirot pointed his cane at a table in the corner. And that empty flower pot, the butler, came closer, examined, and then paled slightly. Funny. I was busy yesterday. I had Accipripedium calceolus, a rare orchid. Madame cared for it with devotion. Poirot approached and examined the damp earth. He bent down and, with his handkerchief, extracted a small half-buried metal tag. He read it, Bleu du Nord, hybrid variant. His eyes shone brightly. And this label? Aubrey looked puzzled. It's not ours. We don't use that kind of identification. All our plants have wooden tags. Poirot turned the label between his fingers. So, someone brought that plant, planted it here, and then took it away, but not without a trace. Poirot stood up and turned towards the door. Monsieur Aubry, can I trust that this room will remain closed without access until further notice? Of course, Monsieur Poirot. The detective nodded and left. In the hallway, Camille was waiting for him, a folder in her hands. I got the photos of the garden you requested. They were taken just after the discovery. He handed her the pictures. Poirot sat down on a nearby bench and began to study them one by one. Genevieve's body appeared slightly reclining, her face tilted to the left. At her feet, the rusty iron bench. To the right, the rose bushes closed around the path as if guarding a secret. At one of the photographs, Poirot paused to look at it. He enlarged it with a magnifying glass. Ah, he said, barely audible. What do you see? Camille asked, her voice low. Poirot turned the photograph towards her. Look at the floor, mademoiselle, under the bench. Can you feel it? Is it a piece of paper? Exactly. A corner of paper barely visible. It wasn't there by chance. And look, there are mud marks. Small shoes, not gardening shoes. Maybe a woman's. Camille seemed to shudder. Do you think Irene? Poirot didn't reply. He slowly closed the folder and stood up with his usual dignity. Mademoiselle, please get me something. A list of all visitors who have come to La Valinière during the last month. Even if they only stayed one night. Include names, dates, and purposes. Do you think the killer came from outside? Not necessarily, but sometimes a shadow enters through the door, disguised as a guest. As Camille walked away with the request, Poirot was left alone in the corridor. The echo of his cane on the tiles resonated like a metronome. The melody of the crime was not yet revealed, but it already had rhythm. Chapter 4. The Midnight Visitor. That same night, Château de la Valinière fell into a silence thicker than usual. The rain had stopped, but the mist lingered, enveloping the garden statues in an almost ghostly veil. Poirot, settled into the guest room in the west wing, meditated by the unlit fireplace, surrounded by notes and photographs. His thoughts revolved around the blue flower, the empty flower pot, and the enigmatic scrap of paper he had noticed under the bench. At 11:15, a soft knock at the door interrupted his concentration. When he opened it, he found Irene de Leracq, wrapped in a purple velvet shawl, her eyes darker than usual. "I couldn't sleep," he said without waiting for an invitation. "Can I come in?" Poirot looked at her for a few seconds. Then he nodded. "Come in, mademoiselle. I suppose you're not just here for insomnia." Irene approached the window and looked out at the gardens. "Since my aunt died, I feel like something's loose in this house, as if there's no one watching over the secrets anymore." Poirot remained silent, watching. "You said we all have a garden we'd rather not show," he finally commented. "Does yours, mademoiselle, bloom with guilt?" She turned toward him slowly. For a moment, she looked like she was going to say something. Then she smiled sadly. "Do you think he hated her? It's not what I believe that matters, but what you're hiding. Whatever you say, your eyes scream something else." Irene sat down opposite him. My aunt was complex. She gave love with one hand and took it away with the other. She raised me after my parents died, but she never let me forget that I wasn't a legitimate de Leracq. I was the daughter of her disgraced sister, the sister who fell in love with the wrong man. And that man, a French botanist. He loved flowers more than people. He died young, but my aunt never forgave my mother for leaving the estate to live with him. Poirot nodded. "Is that why Mrs. de Leracq closed the garden?" Irene lowered her gaze. "That's where they said goodbye. The garden was their secret place until she turned it into a prison." Poirot bowed slightly. "And what about you? Have you ever been there?" "Never, until a week ago." His words hung in the air. "I suspected as much," Poirot said calmly. "The dirt stains on your slippers, the faint scent of orchids, which isn't in your room, but is in the greenhouse." Irene seemed unfazed. I was curious. I found a key in an old drawer in the study. I didn't know it still worked. One night I went in. I saw the bench, the deer statue, and I stayed for a while. It was disturbing. Disturbing how? I felt someone else was there. I swore I heard footsteps, but I didn't see anyone. I ran back to the castle. The next day the key was gone. Poirot laced his fingers in his lap. "Did you discuss it with anyone?" "No. Who would believe me? It seems like I'm trying to get an inheritance quickly. And I'm not interested in inheritance. I just want to get out of this place." He stood up, and for a second his gaze softened. "If you find out who did it, don't be merciful." My aunt had many enemies hiding under the skin of her protégés, and without further ado he left the room. Poirot was left alone, the echo of his words still ringing. He stood up, took his walking stick, and quietly went down to the study. The castle was asleep. The only sounds were the creaking of ancient wood and the distant ticking of a grandfather clock. Madame de Leracq's study was a room lined with bookshelves, filled with old volumes on botany, family history, and private correspondence. Poirot went directly to an oak chest of drawers in a dark corner. He opened the second drawer, empty, then the third. Inside, a black velvet case. When he opened it, he found a bunch of keys. But what caught his attention wasn't the metal. It was the piece of cloth wrapped around one of them. A blue cloth, the same shade as the flower found in the lady's hand. Poirot took it delicately, examining it in the light of his pocket torch. On the edge, hand-embroidered, were two initials, A.D. "Ah," murmured Poirot, "the gardener's name is Bastien, but his full name is Aubin Désiré Bastien." He closed the case again, put the cloth in his pocket, and left the studio with calculated steps. The puzzle had more pieces than it seemed, and now one of them had begun to fall into place. Chapter 5. Whispers of the Past. The next morning, the sky was a pale sheet, without sun or shade. The entire estate seemed to hold its breath, as if death still lurked among the trees. Hercule Poirot ate breakfast alone in the dining-room, leafing through his notebook again. When Paul the butler came to clear his dishes, Poirot stopped him with a gesture. "Just a moment, Monsieur Aubry. I'd like to speak to you, not as a butler, but as someone who has lived in this house longer than anyone else." Paul, with his usual rectitude, nodded and waited. "What do you know about the relationship between Madame Geneviève and the gardener Bastien?" "Professional," he replied without hesitation. "She trusted his work. She allowed him access to restricted areas, like the Forbidden Garden. Do you know if Bastien has any other names?" The butler blinked in surprise. "Aubin Désiré. Bastien, if my memory serves me right." Poirot nodded with satisfaction. "Thank you. That's what I suspected." Paul hesitated for a moment, then bowed slightly. "Did you find anything, monsieur?" "Perhaps," said Poirot, taking out the small piece of cloth with the initials embroidered on it. "Do you recognize this?" The butler examined him, and his face tensed for a split second. It belonged to the gardening staff's old uniforms. They were discarded years ago. Only Bastien wore them. Poirot watched this slight change in expression closely. "Thank you, Mr. Aubry. You've been very helpful." When the butler had left, Poirot got up and went out into the garden. He had asked to be left alone there that morning, and no one dared to disobey him. He walked along the gravel paths until he reached the Forbidden Garden. The gate was still closed, but it no longer had the sacred air of taboo. It looked more like a theatre scene, whose curtain had not yet fallen. He took the recovered key from the case in the study, the same one Irene had used according to her confession. It fit perfectly in the lock. The metallic click seemed to break the silence like a bell. Inside, the garden smelled of damp and ancient secrets. Roses climbed the iron arches, and the rusty bench was still in place, just as in the photographs. Poirot approached the statue of the deer, a stone figure covered in lichen. At its feet something barely visible protruded from the disturbed earth, a shard of pottery. Poirot picked it up. It was part of a flower pot. He turned it over between his fingers. At its base, a blurred, partially illegible mark could be read. "Blue of the same pot as the missing flower," he murmured. "But why bury it?" He continued exploring. He found a dark stain at the base of the bench, mud mixed with something else. Ink? He took a small vial from his jacket and collected a sample with a cotton swab. Then he heard footsteps. He turned quickly. Bastien was standing behind him, his boots wet, a stern expression on his face. "You shouldn't be here, Monsieur Poirot." "Oh, but I have permission." "And a key," Poirot replied, raising his eyebrow. "Perhaps the same one you lost years ago, which has now reappeared in a locked drawer." Bastien clenched his jaw. "I don't know what you're talking about." Poirot walked slowly towards him, his eyes fixed on his. "You grew that flower." "It didn't grow here. It was a hybrid." "Was it a special order? A souvenir?" Bastien swallowed. "It was for Madame. A surprise. The flower her husband gave her the night before he died. She wanted to see it one last time." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Did she ask for it?" "Yes, but then she changed her mind. She told me I shouldn't bring up the past, but it was too late. The flower bloomed. I showed it to her. She cried." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "And then he took her here?" "No, I left it in the greenhouse. Someone else brought it." Poirot looked at him for a long time. His breathing was steady, but his pupils vibrated with a hidden anxiety. "Who else saw her?" "I don't know. Only Irene was near the greenhouse. But I don't think— Do you think Madame de Lérac was poisoned?" Bastien hesitated. "No, but she had a weak heart. Fear, emotion. It might have been enough." Poirot nodded slowly. "But you know it wasn't a coincidence." The gardener didn't reply. He turned and walked down the path without another word. Poirot watched her disappear into the bushes. Then he sat down on the bench where the old woman had been found. Silence returned, interrupted only by the distant call of a bird. In his hands he held the piece of pottery. In his mind the pieces were beginning to form a pattern: the lost flower, the forgotten key, the embroidered fabric, and now the induced fear. It wasn't a bloody murder. It was a subtle one. Emotional, perfectly orchestrated, and there were still notes to be read in that symphony. Chapter 6. The Unsent Letter. Upon returning from the Forbidden Garden, Poirot found Camille waiting for him in the library. The young secretary was holding a folder with obvious nervousness, as if its contents were burning in her hands. Seeing him enter, she immediately sat up straight. "Monsieur Poirot, I found this in one of Madame's desk drawers. It was hidden under a false bottom. I thought, perhaps you should see it first." Poirot accepted the folder with a nod and sat down by the window. Outside, the trees were swaying slowly, and the morning mist was just beginning to dissipate. He carefully took out the contents: a sheet of thick yellowish paper written with a black fountain pen. It was an unsigned and unsealed letter, but dated 4 days before Geneviève de Lérac's death. He read aloud to himself and to Camille, who stood motionless nearby. "Dear Louise, it's been too many years since we cut all ties. I don't seek excuses, nor would you. I'll just say that time has revealed truths that our youth made us ignore. I've lived a prisoner of my own decisions. The Forbidden Garden wasn't a prisoner of what happened there, but because of what I wanted to forget. He didn't love me. He s'était dire, loved you. And I've always known it. I was wrong. I clung to ownership, to the family name, to duty. And in doing so, I robbed Irene of a place where she belonged. I want to correct that. The will has been amended. She will receive what is rightfully hers, But if anything happens to me before this becomes official, I beg you, protect her. It's the only thing left for me to do right." Geneviève but Camille covered her lips with a hand, excited. "This changes everything." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, this letter was written but never sent. Which raises a question. Who knew of its existence? No one. Only I checked his correspondence. And this, as I said, was hidden. So, it wasn't an external communication that motivated what came next," Poirot said, "but an internal change, a gesture of redemption, one that someone wanted to prevent." Put the letter back in the folder and looked at Camille with renewed interest. "Tell me, mademoiselle, did you know the will had been changed?" She hesitated, but answered truthfully. "Yes, I was the one who wrote the draft under his dictation. It was signed before a notary last week. And the document? It's in the hands of Etienne Roussel, the lawyer." Poirot stood up immediately. "Then it's time to talk to Monsieur Roussel." He found him in his makeshift office, in one of the rooms in the north wing, surrounded by open folders and neatly arranged papers. Seeing him arrive, Roussel took off his glasses and smiled cautiously. "Monsieur Poirot, to what do I owe the honour?" "To the will," Poirot replied with surgical precision. "The new one." The lawyer's smile faded. "Ah, yes. I'm surprised you already know that." "Nothing surprises me, monsieur," replied Poirot. "Could you show me a copy?" Roussel opened a locked drawer and took out a grey cardboard envelope. He extracted a wax-sealed document. "That's the one. Madame de Lérac designated Irene as the principal heir to the estate. She also granted lifetime pensions to Camille and the gardener Bastien." Poirot examined it without touching it, as if the paper might be contaminated by contact. "And did anyone else know about its contents?" "Not that I know of. The lady was very discreet." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And yet it's clear that someone knew, or suspected, and feared that their own interests would be reduced to nothing." Roussel visibly tensed. "Are you implying that someone murdered her for money?" Poirot smiled kindly. "I'm not insinuating. I'm just observing. And in my experience, monsieur, the motives for a crime are usually love, jealousy, or greed. Sometimes a combination of all three." Roussel put the document away again. "I assure you that I only did my duty." "Oh, I believe so," said Poirot, rising. "But remember, duty, when combined with fear, can become dangerous." Already in the corridor, Poirot crossed paths with Bastien, who was carrying a toolbox. "Is everything okay, Monsieur Poirot?" "For now, yes. But soon everything will be out in the open." And without waiting for an answer, he walked toward the lobby, where the clock struck exactly noon. The unmailed letter, the amended will, the silent gardener, and the displaced niece who was now the heir. The net was tightening, and Poirot, with his meticulous gait and his mind like a scalpel, was preparing to cut the knot that tied the past to the present. Chapter 7. The Melody in the Night. The afternoon dragged on slowly at La Valinière, as if time itself refused to reveal the truth that floated, invisible but palpable, within its ancient walls. After his conversation with Roussel, Poirot asked Camille to organize something unusual. A musical evening in the drawing-room, with everyone present gathered. A social event, he said, to calm things down. But Camille, who already knew the way the detective disguised his strategy, knew that it wasn't just music Poirot was looking for. So, at 8 o'clock sharp, under the crystal chandelier that hung, like a glass moon, everyone gathered. Irene, elegant and ethereal, like an inky shadow. Roussel, still tense-faced. Bastien, dressed in a clean but badly ironed shirt. Paul Aubry, discreet and silent. And Camille, nervous but serene at the piano. Poirot sat down near the unlit hearth, his hands folded on his walking stick, his eyes scanning every gesture. Mademoiselle Dupré has been kind enough to prepare a short recital, she said softly. I hope you all enjoy it, and that perhaps, between notes, the truth will emerge. Camille began to play a slow piece by Debussy. The notes floated in the air like delicate mist. For minutes no one spoke, but Poirot watched. The light tapping of Irene's fingers against the sofa, the steady crunch of Roussel's shoes on the floor, the way Bastien avoided looking at the piano. When Camille finished, Poirot stood up. Thank you, mademoiselle. A lovely performance, as evocative as it is revealing. He paused. No one spoke. Let me share something with you. Today, in the Forbidden Garden, I found a fragment of the pot containing the blue flower Madame Geneviève was holding when she died. It was deliberately buried. Beside it, an ink stain, perhaps from a broken inkwell or a fountain pen. What mind would think of planting such a scene? Those present looked at each other. Silence. But even more interesting, continued Poirot, strolling among them, was finding in the study a key wrapped in cloth with the initials A.D. Aubin Désiré Bastien. A key lost years ago? Or hidden on purpose? Bastien shifted in his seat. I already told you the flower was a sentimental request. Nothing more. Yes, you spoke of a flower for Madame. But the unsent letter, Poirot held up a folded sheet, suggests another story. In it, Madame de Lérac confesses to having been I. Network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. Chapter 7. An Interrupted Confession. That afternoon, as the shadows began to lengthen on the cobbled floor of La Valinière, Poirot sat in the main drawing-room, his unmistakable figure silhouetted against the window. He had requested that no one interrupt him while he analyzed the fragments he had collected over the past few days. On the tea-table he arranged in meticulous order the embroidered cloth with initials, the piece of pottery, the unmailed letter, and a copy of his recently drawn-up will. The pieces were almost complete, but there was still a spark, a movement that would reveal the ultimate intention. At 5 o'clock sharp, as if obeying an invisible schedule, Camille appeared on the threshold. Monsieur Poirot, he said in a low voice, Mademoiselle Irene wishes to speak with you, privately. Poirot nodded without surprise. With pleasure, let him come. Irene entered shortly after, dressed in pearl grey, her face more serene than in previous days. There was a determination in her gaze she hadn't shown before. Monsieur Poirot? He began bluntly. I think I must tell you something. Something I haven't told anyone. Poirot leaned back, folded his hands, and nodded slightly. I'm listening, mademoiselle. She took a few steps forward. Then she stopped in front of the empty fireplace. "The night before my aunt died. We argued. Poirot was unfazed. For what reason? Because of the will," he replied in a lower voice. "I discovered it accidentally. I went into her study looking for a book and found a sheet of legal notes. She caught me reading it. She got angry, but then she confessed she'd done it for me, that she wanted to make amends for the past." Poirot watched her fixedly. "And how did you respond?" "I was confused, excited. I never thought I'd be capable of such an act. But also, I was scared. Scared that it wouldn't make it in time, that someone else would stop it. I begged him to make it official as soon as possible." "Did he do it?" "Yes. He told me it was already signed and given to the lawyer. But then, all of a sudden, he asked me something strange." Poirot leaned forward a little. "For something strange?" "Yes. He asked me if I had recently entered the Forbidden Garden. The room seemed to cool down a bit with that phrase." "And what did you answer?" Irene lowered her gaze. "I lied. I said no." She looked at me sadly, as if she knew the truth. She didn't say anything else, only that her chest hurt and she wanted to rest. I left. That was the last time I saw her alive. Poirot stood up slowly. He walked to the table where his belongings were laid out. "Mademoiselle, do you recognize this fabric?" Irene took it with trembling hands. "It's one of the old uniforms, the ones Bastien wore years ago. I had one. We wore it as kids, to play in the greenhouse." Poirot nodded. "This piece was wrapped in the key that was found in the study drawer, the key you used to enter the garden." Irene looked at him with growing unease. "Are you saying that someone tried to implicate me?" "No. I'm saying someone wanted to make it seem like you were more guilty than you were. And that person had access to the study and the past." Before Irene could respond, a sharp knock interrupted the conversation. Paul Aubrey, the butler, appeared in the doorway, visibly agitated. "Monsieur Poirot, you must come. It's Camille. We found her in the greenhouse. She's unconscious." Minutes later, Poirot arrived at the greenhouse, followed by Roussel and Irene. There, between the growing tables and hanging orchids, Camille lay on the floor, a notebook clutched to her chest. She was breathing, albeit with difficulty. "What happened?" Poirot asked firmly. "We found her like this," Paul replied. "One of the gardeners saw her come in, and then heard a crash. She thought she'd fainted from the heat." Poirot bent down carefully. He examined the notebook. It was a new one, different from Camille's usual one. He opened it. On the first page, a shaky handwritten sentence. "If something happens to me, this notebook explains why." Poirot closed the notebook and put it in his coat. "Call the doctor. No one else is allowed in here until further notice." When he turned to Irene and Roussel, his face had changed. The expression was grave, eloquent, that of a man who already sees the full form of the truth. "Now then, mes amis," he murmured, "the music has started to play, and the final waltz was approaching." Chapter 8. The notebook of last words. Night fell heavily on La Valinière. The rain had returned, gently tapping on the stained glass windows of the drawing-room where Hercule Poirot sat alone in front of the fireplace. The fire crackled discreetly, but it failed to dissipate the tension that filled the room. Outside, the wind rustled the branches of the ancient lime trees, as if nature itself were conspiring to keep the house awake. In his lap, Poirot held the notebook Camille had left clutched to her chest before fainting. He had waited for the local doctor to confirm that the young woman was stable. A minor blow to the head, possibly a fall. There were no signs of poisoning, although Poirot had ordered a watchful eye as a precaution. But what mattered now was what Camille had written. He opened the notebook. Camille's handwriting was clear, neat, meticulous. And yet, as she continued, it became more uneven, as if fear had begun to gain the upper hand. I've decided to record what I know, in case I never get around to telling Poirot in person. Madame de Lérac confided in me more than some would suppose. She knew her end was near. She told me about the blue flower, the garden, and her guilt. But she also confessed something disturbing. In recent days, she felt someone was watching her. Memories weren't enough. Someone was making her feel hunted. She asked me to look through her old papers, in case there was anything that could clear Louise's name, her sister. I did, and I found an old letter written by Louise, begging for forgiveness. I took it to the study to talk it over with her that night. But when I went to get it, she was already dead. Poirot turned the page. The next lines were more hurried, more nervous. What I haven't said until now is that since then someone has entered my room. I notice it. They're going through my drawers. I know they're looking for that letter, but I didn't put it there. I hid it where only I would look, inside a 19th century gardening book in the library. The volume is called Les Fleurs de l'Oubli. And there's something else. Last night I saw Etienne Roussel leaving the ladies' study. He wasn't carrying his briefcase. He was carrying an envelope. Poirot slowly closed the notebook. His gaze hardened. Roussel. So far, always correct, always helpful, but perhaps too willing, too present. A lawyer so meticulous that he seemed to have every answer before the question was even asked. Shortly after, Poirot entered the library alone. The house was silent. The others were asleep or pretending to be. The grandfather clock struck 11. He quickly searched for the aforementioned volume. It took him less than 5 minutes to locate it. The Flowers of Oblivion. Antique binding, gilt title on the spine. He took it off the shelf and opened it. Between the centre pages, protected by a sheet of waxed paper, he found the letter. The handwriting was shaky but steady. Louise wrote to her sister with suppressed pain, "You kept his last name. I kept his words of love. I never blamed you entirely. He made his choice. But when you buried him, you buried me too. Irene isn't to blame. Give him what you never gave him, a home." Poirot sighed. Then he stuffed the letter inside his coat. Without wasting any time, he headed to the guest wing, where Roussel had his room. He knocked. A pause. Then the door opened a crack. "Monsieur, Poirot, at this hour?" "I can't sleep," he replied with a soft smile. "And I've been wondering if you can." "I was trying," the lawyer said, opening the door a little wider. "Is there something urgent?" "Maybe. Can I come in?" Roussel hesitated for a second, then nodded. Poirot entered. The room was as tidy as expected. A leather briefcase on the desk, neatly arranged documents, everything in perfect order. "Do you mind if I ask directly?" said Poirot, taking a seat. "Where were you last night between 9 and 10? "In my room," Roussel replied calmly, "working on some legal papers." "Can anyone confirm this?" "I don't think so. I didn't have any visitors." Poirot nodded. "I understand. And where were you the day Madame de Lérac died, at 11 in the morning?" "In the greenhouse, going over some papers with Camille. She can vouch for that." "But Camille is no longer in a position to confirm anything, right?" Poirot's voice was soft but cutting. Roussel frowned. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting. I'm just checking." Poirot stood up. "There's something in this house that reeks of fear, Monsieur Roussel. And fear always leaves its mark, even on those who believe themselves above suspicion." And without waiting for an answer, he left the room. Camille had left a thread, and he was following it to the end. Chapter 9. The Veil of Motive. The next morning was clearer than the previous ones. A pale sun was beginning to filter its light onto the cold tiles of the hall, as if trying to dispel the secrets that still clung to the walls of La Valinière. But Hercule Poirot knew that clarity depended not on the weather, but on the moment when all the pieces fell into place. And that moment was approaching. At 8 o'clock sharp, Poirot asked to see the gardener Bastien in the blue drawing-room. The man arrived with his usual stern expression, hat in hand, and a fresh stain of earth on his left sleeve. "Thank you for coming, Monsieur Bastien," Poirot said, rising with his usual courtesy. "I have a few final questions. I beg your patience, and above all, your sincerity." Bastien nodded, uncomfortable but resigned. "Sir, I'm listening." Poirot studied him silently for a few seconds before speaking. "Did you know about the relationship between Madame de Lérac and her sister Louise? Just what was said around here. That they hated each other. That one kept the house, and the other the dishonour. And yet," Poirot continued, in a softer tone, "you grew a special flower for the lady, one that symbolized precisely that story." Bastien frowned. "I did it out of respect. She asked me to." "And didn't it seem strange to you that, after rejecting that flower for years, I now wanted to see it bloom again?" "Yes, sir. But I don't ask questions. I grow what I'm asked to grow." Poirot walked slowly towards the window, then turned sharply. "Did you know that the will had been changed?" The gardener blinked, surprised. "No. Did he really change it?" "Yes. Irene would inherit the estate, and you would receive a lifetime pension, a gesture of gratitude." Bastien's face changed into a look of both relief and confusion. "So, why would anyone want to kill her?" "Exactly what I'm trying to find out," said Poirot. "But I'll ask you one last question, monsieur. Did you ever see Roussel entering or leaving the study in recent days, outside of normal hours?" Bastien hesitated for a few seconds. "One night I saw him leave through the side door. He was carrying a large envelope. I thought it was mail for the notary." "Did he seem nervous to you?" "No, more like hurried, as if he didn't want to be seen." Poirot nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Bastien. You've been very helpful." Later, Poirot discreetly made his way to Etienne Roussel's makeshift office. The lawyer was away, so he took the opportunity to go through the personal belongings he had left on his desk. It wasn't something he did often. He preferred mines to drawers, but sometimes objects also lied less. He found what he expected, an unlettered envelope, its seal broken. Inside, a document dated 3 days before Genevieve's death, a revocation of her previous will. Poirot examined it carefully. The document was neatly written, but one signature was missing, Madame de Lérac's. He smiled. "Ah, Monsieur Roussel," he murmured, "you planned well, but you didn't count on her dying before signing, did you?" He put the document in his coat and left the office just as Roussel entered from the hallway. "Monsieur Poirot, what were you doing in my office?" Poirot turned slowly, serene. "A simple check, sir. As a good lawyer, you know that unsigned documents are worthless." Roussel stared at him. His face was a mask, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, a shadow of unease. "I warn you that you have no right to snoop through my belongings." "And I remind you," Poirot replied sharply, "that you had no right to rewrite the will of a dying woman in the hope of protecting your own interests." Roussel opened his mouth to reply, but Poirot was already walking in the opposite direction. That evening, Poirot summoned Irène de Lerac to his room. He found her sitting by the window, gazing out over the gardens in the moonlight. "Is everything moving towards a conclusion, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked, a hint of weariness in his voice. "Everything, mademoiselle. I can almost hear the last note of the concert." She looked at him with a hint of irony. "And who's holding the violin?" Poirot came over and placed Camille's notebook on the small table. "Sometimes it's not the one playing the melody who composes the work, and sometimes the one who thinks he's in control doesn't see that he's already been exposed." She watched him without responding. Poirot moved a little closer. "Mademoiselle Irène, I beg you to be present in the main hall tomorrow at 10 o'clock, along with everyone else, so that finally the truth can be heard." As Irène left, Poirot was left alone in the shadows. He adjusted the edges of the handkerchief in his pocket and looked at himself for a second in the mirror. "The little grey cells, mon ami," he said to himself, "have danced enough, and tomorrow they would take their final bow." Chapter 10. The Final Meeting. The clock struck 10 as the occupants of La Valinière began to gather in the main drawing-room, as Hercule Poirot had requested. Outside, a light mist covered the lawn, giving the morning an almost theatrical air. Inside, the atmosphere was more tense than ever. Irène de Lerac, sitting by the window, gazed distantly at the rose bushes in the forbidden garden. Etienne, Roussel, impeccably dressed but visibly uncomfortable, hovered near the fireplace. Paul Aubrey, the butler, stood with his hands clasped behind his back. Bastien, the gardener, remained silent, leaning against the wall. Camille Dupré, still somewhat pale after the incident in the greenhouse, had insisted on attending, even though Poirot had recommended rest. And finally, Poirot entered. Impeccable, serene, every hair of his moustache perfectly aligned, the Belgian detective walked with measured stride to the centre of the room. He didn't sit down. He stood, hands folded on his cane, and looked at each person carefully before speaking. "Mesdames and messieurs," he began, "we have reached the end of this story. A story that began with the death of Madame Geneviève de Lérac, found among the rose bushes of a garden that, for more than 30 years, remained sealed like a treasure chest of family secrets." He paused. At first, everything pointed to a natural death. An elderly woman with a history of heart disease, found with no signs of violence. But as always, I urge you to remember, appearances can be deceiving. And in this case, they fooled everyone except the little grey cells. Poirot walked slowly around the room. The first sign of wrongdoing was the blue flower in her hand. It wasn't a plant from the garden. It wasn't in the greenhouse. And yet it appeared. How? Because someone brought it. A rare hybrid flower grown by Bastien at the lady's request. But then hidden. Why? Because the symbol of that past had power. Emotional, psychological. He looked at the gardener. Bastien followed an order. He didn't act on his own initiative. The flower was used by others. Poirot turned to Irene. "Mademoiselle, you admitted to having entered the garden before her death. But you weren't the only one. The garden was violated by those who wanted to control Geneviève's memory and her fortune." Now he looked directly at Etienne Roussel. "You, sir, tried to suppress a valid will. You drew up another one with more favourable terms for you and your allies. But you couldn't get the lady to sign it. So you waited. Or provoked. Roussel is a magpie. That's false. I followed legal orders. I haven't touched a cent of that inheritance." "Not yet," said Poirot, with icy calm. "But if the new will had been signed, Irene would have been displaced, and you, as executor, you would have complete power over the estate. That gave you motivation. But you didn't act alone." Poirot held up Camille's notebook. This diary revealed that Camille knew more than she had said, and that someone was watching her. They tried to silence her, but they failed. She hid the letter from Louise, the exiled sister, that changed the family's entire outlook. A letter Geneviève wanted to protect. The final gesture of a woman who wanted justice, not just legal, but moral. Poirot paused. He walked towards the fireplace. The night before her death, Geneviève was manipulated, scared, by someone who knew her intimately, who knew which words could quicken her pulse and stop her heart. He turned around. No poison was needed, no weapon, just pressure, suggestion, the memory of guilt, and a flower. Poirot now stared at Paul Aubrey. "You, sir, knew the lady's habits better than anyone. You had access to the study, to the key. You knew where the old letters were kept, and you knew she planned to redeem Irene. That disturbed you, because you, a faithful servant of the de Léracs for decades, had hoped the estate would pass into more conservative hands, not to a niece you considered illegitimate." Paul didn't respond. His expression was icy. "You set the scene. You placed the flower in her hands. You told her things no one else knew. You pushed her emotionally to the brink." Poirot took a step closer, and then he warned Roussel, "Because you shared a goal. He had ambition. You had resentment." Silence. Camille brought a hand to her mouth. Irene stared at Paul, incredulous. Finally, the butler spoke. his voice tense. She was going to destroy everything this house stood for. The name, the heritage, the order. I served her all my life. And in the end, I was going to give it all up to a bastard. Irene jumped up. I'm your sister's daughter, not a bastard. Poirot raised his hand, serene. The crime, my friends, wasn't one of blood. It was one of ego, of identity, of legacy. He returned to his place and smoothed down his vest. I've informed the police. They'll be here shortly. There's enough evidence. Paul closed his eyes. He didn't resist. Roussel, livid, sank into a chair. He knew his days as a lawyer were over. Poirot finally sat down. The case was solved. And now, he said softly, the garden can bloom again. This time, without secrets. The clock struck 11. The echo sounded like applause, and the curtain finally fell. Chapter 11. Justice among Rosals. The police arrived shortly after noon. 2 uniformed officers from Tours, along with Commissioner Bernard Celestin, crossed the threshold of La Valinière with stern faces and firm steps. Poirot received them in the hall with the courtesy of a host in his own home, but with the seriousness of someone who has unearthed an uncomfortable truth. Paul Aubrey was escorted out without resistance. He walked upright, looking at no one. He denied nothing, but neither did he confess. His silence was the last act of misguided loyalty to a family that no longer existed as he had idealized it. Etienne Roussel, although not arrested, was summoned to testify before an investigating judge for document forgery and attempted inheritance fraud. His legal fate still hung in the balance, but his reputation was irreparably tarnished. Poirot, from the library, watched with disturbing calm as the social equilibrium of the house crumbled. Irene, on the other hand, stayed away from the hustle and bustle. She didn't cry, she didn't celebrate. She just walked slowly toward the forbidden garden, as if she needed to confirm with her own eyes that the tragedy hadn't been a dream. Poirot caught up with her there, among the rose bushes, which were now swaying gently in a fresh breeze. Irene was sitting on the rusty iron bench, the same one where her aunt had taken her last breath. "I never thought I'd end up here," she said without turning around. "And yet here it is," Poirot replied gently. "The story ends, mademoiselle, where it began, among flowers that know how to keep secrets." She looked down at the ground. "Do you think my aunt loved me, even a little?" Poirot sat down slowly beside him. Yes, in its difficult, imperfect, and belated form. Yes, the letter he wrote to his sister, the decision to change the will, his request for that lost flower. They were gestures. Not all affection is loud. Irene smiled sadly. "The funny thing is, I never wanted the inheritance. I just wanted to belong." Poirot nodded. "And now he does. But not because of a document, but because he resisted the truth without breaking, and because he chose not to respond with hatred." Silence. The leaves rustled softly. A robin hopped from branch to branch. "And you, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked suddenly. "Do you believe in justice?" He narrowed his eyes. "I believe in the justice of the soul. The law can punish, but only the heart can redeem. Today, this house has had both." Irene stood up. "I want to change this garden. remove the most aggressive rose bushes, plant jasmine and dahlias. Something more. Cosy. Poirot stood up too. An excellent idea. The past can hurt, but it can also be transformed. Before leaving, Poirot took Louise's letter, carefully tucked between 2 sheets of paper, from his inside jacket. Pocket, this belongs to you. Keep it. Not as evidence, but as a root. Irene took it gently. For a few seconds she said nothing. Then she murmured, "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, not only for uncovering the truth, but for restoring some of its beauty." That evening, as the last rays of the sun gilded the hills of Touraine, Poirot packed his suitcase with his usual infallible method. Every item folded to the millimetre, every object packed in its exact place. Nothing improvised, nothing out of order. Before closing the suitcase, he looked at his reflection in the full-length mirror. "One more house, one less crime," he said, to himself, "but always the same human heart." He walked out of the room with a firm step. In the hallway, Camille was waiting for him with a cup of coffee and a look of deep respect. "Will you ever come back, Monsieur Poirot?" "Maybe," he replied with a half-smile, "but I hope it's not for a crime." And with his cane in hand, he descended the main staircase, crossed the hall where the portraits of past generations still hung silently, and stepped out into the open air. A car was waiting for him on the path. La Valinière, for the first time in many years, seemed to have found peace, and the forbidden garden had finally been opened to the light. Chapter 12. Poirot's Last Remark. 2 weeks had passed since the events that shook La Valinière. The headlines of the Parisian newspapers had already lost interest in the Delerac case, displaced by political scandals and more bloody crimes. But in Touraine, and especially within the silent corridors of the estate, the consequences were still felt like persistent echoes within the walls. Hercule Poirot, back in his Brussels apartment, had happily resumed his routine. Tea at 5, orchids by the window, long walks along the Place Jourdan, with his coat buttoned to the neck and his cane tapping steadily on the ground. However, as always happened after a particularly delicate decision, his mind returned again and again to the faces he had left behind. One morning, while meticulously organizing a series of pending letters, she received an unexpected visitor. It was a young Belgian postman who handed her an unlettered envelope sealed with red string. Poirot, with his usual attention to detail, noticed the Tours postmark and the neat handwriting of someone who has learned to write with conviction. He opened the envelope and unfolded the contents. A short sheet of paper, accompanied by a photograph. He read silently. "Mr. Poirot, I've begun the garden renovations. As promised, the most aggressive rose bushes have been moved. In their place, the first dahlias have already bloomed. I've left one section untouched, not out of forgetfulness, but out of respect. There, under a flat stone, I've buried my mother's letter and the newspaper clipping with her name. Not as a tribute to the tragedy, but as the seed of something more worthy. Camille has agreed to stay on as the property manager. She says she wants to bring this house back to life with more useful things than secrets. And I'm learning not to be afraid of belonging. That's justice enough. With eternal gratitude, Hercule Poirot took the photograph. It was a black and white photo taken from a low angle, showing the newly renovated garden path. The young flowers, the artfully pruned trees, and in the centre, the old rusty bench, now restored, painted white. Beside it, a small bronze sculpture. A deer, identical to the original statue, but with a blue flower between its teeth. Poirot smiled tenderly. Then he poured himself a cup of tea and settled into his favourite armchair. For a few minutes he remained silent. Then, without addressing anyone, he began to speak in a low voice, like someone reciting a lesson learned over time. The truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it hides behind good manners, rehearsed words, or a seemingly harmless flower, but even then it always waits to be seen. And the guilty, however silent, eventually reveal themselves, not because they're careless, but because they underestimate what one can uncover with human psychology. He gently raised the cup. Madame Geneviève died of fear. A carefully induced fear. Paul Aubrey knew just what to say to her to awaken the past. Enough to break a fragile heart. But what he didn't foresee was that his attempt to protect an idea, the purity of a family, would end up destroying it completely. He placed the cup on the saucer and stood up. And Roussel, so ambitious, so convinced of his legality, that he forgot morality. His role wasn't that of a murderer, but that of an opportunist. And justice, mes amis, also extends to those who hide behind technicalities. Poirot walked to the window. Outside, and a fine drizzle dampened the streets of Brussels. He stared intently at his reflection in the glass. Irène de Lerac inherited a house, yes, but more importantly, she inherited a truth. A story she didn't choose, but which she can now rewrite. That, in the end, is what matters. A knock at the door interrupted his meditation. It was his faithful friend Dr. Stempels, carrying a copy of The Evening. Another closed story, Poirot. Oui, mon ami. And closed with a silver clasp. Payment? Poirot smiled. Gold is for victories. Silver. For those who understand that, sometimes beauty is born from pain. As evening descended on Brussels, Poirot sat down to write in his personal diary, a habit reserved only for cases that truly affected him. Case La Valinière. Conclusion. Justice was served without violence. The crime was not committed by gun or poison, but by intent. A crime of the soul, more difficult to punish, but also more necessary to solve. Note, the garden has bloomed again, and with that he closed the notebook. The case was complete, and the little grey cells had, once again, done their job.